It was you, wasn't it?
Visual form of working memory.
This is an example of my working memory. Yeah, right. This is an example of my working memory there. It's like, remember, it was you that said that, wasn't it?
Yeah.
In a way. Okay, so there's some evidence that suggests that the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is involved in linear and sequential and verbal working memory, whereas the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is involved in visual working memory or visuospatial working memory. To give you an example of this study, they showed people words, which you could only remember using words, and then they showed people abstract shapes, which you could only remember visually. So they weren't showing somebody a square, because you could remember that as square and use your verbal working memory. And then what they did was they used this transcranial magnetic stimulation to temporarily reduce the activity of neurons in one side or the other, and then looked at how it impaired the person's ability to remember either the words or the shapes. And that's basically what gave them evidence about that. Yeah.
Would a conceptual memory be classified as falling within
could be a bit of both.
verbal? Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah, could easily be a bit of both, really. I'm a very verbal person. I use pictures to show people stuff, but I don't visually imagine pictures. I'm a very verbal person. Some people are more visual than others.
But a lot of ideas which are ultimately expressed verbally might actually be contemplated in a pre-verbal sense, mentally.
Maybe. Yeah, I know what you're saying. I know what you're saying. Yeah?
Is the brain very, very efficient at the visuospatial side of this, or very inefficient at the other side? From a computer memory point of view,
yeah.
Images versus words or digits?
Yeah, that's a very, in terms of AI, that's a very difficult thing to solve, isn't it? I believe that people have a better visual memory, apparently, than a verbal memory. But I can't actually think of like a proper study to cite for you on that off the top of my head. I'm pretty sure that given a whole bunch of pictures, people are better at remembering what pictures they've seen before or not, than given a whole bunch of words. If that makes sense. But there's limited capacity in both of these different sorts of working memory. The frontal lobes are more to do with control of working memory, rather than necessarily its capacity as well. I don't think that's really answered your question.
There's also, like, isn't there a question between the difference between symbolic versus concrete processing? So because some individuals, going back to what you just said, like, I think whether you prefer, for example, if you are more of a concrete processor, you'll remember the image of a tree better.
Right.
Whereas if you're a symbolic processor, you'll remember the word tree better, for example.
Yeah, that could well correspond to individual differences in working memory. Yeah. That makes sense. I haven't read about that myself, but that makes sense.
Right.
Yeah, like people have got different strengths and weaknesses in the different aspects of working memory, and that would correspond to it. Yeah. So I would have thought that the larger your working memory, perhaps the greater the capacity for abstract thought as well. But I may be wrong there. I may be speculating a little, but in any case, you get people that have deficits in this with brain injury, basically. Okay, so the next one is the orbitofrontal cortex. And this, I think, is the area that is primarily damaged in Phineas Gage. People with damage to the orbitofrontal cortex, which is just about here and behind the orbits of the eyes, also often referred to as the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, can either be emotionally blunt or emotionally disinhibited, depending upon probably subdivisions within it that get damaged. They can have problems making their mind up, they can have problems making sensible judgments about a course of action. They can lack persistence, they can lack planning into the future, and then they can also lack insight into their condition, although I've put a star by this for a reason. They can also be socially inappropriate, have problems with being tactful, they might be facetious, or they might have a thing called Witzelsucht, which is a word from German meaning boring or pointless stories or jokes, which you have to see in a brain-injured person to really understand. I couldn't find a video of it on YouTube.
Sounds like most people.
Drunkenness to me.
Oh yeah.
Drunkenness.
Yeah, definitely. Again, it's probably something that I should look up to see. That I'm sure someone will have done a study on this. The parts of your brain that get inhibited by alcohol to start off with are worrying about the future, which is why it's quite nice because it makes your stress go away. Right? Then you can be like emotionally disinhibited, so you might cry, you might get angry, you might get aggressive. You don't think about the future, and you can lose like social inappropriateness, or you might just be a drunken bore. And so very much these parts of the brain are involved, and the drunker people get, the further back the lack of control seems to go. Because it's only once people get quite drunk that they start to slur, which is probably areas connected to Broca's area, or to lose motor coordination, which, if you recall, are towards the back of the frontal lobes. So it's possibly that the more higher areas of self-control get inhibited first by alcohol, and then the lower areas of self-control get inhibited later on, if that makes sense. But you're right, it's very much like drunkenness, and I've always thought that. And in extreme cases, this can lead to things like violence or inappropriate sexual behaviour. Yeah?
Is there any sort of chemical basis for the front? Why the front of the brain being inhibited first back? And not
right. I don't know. I would I mean, as far as the chemical basis is, I really couldn't tell you. You'd have to speak to a neuroscientist. As far as, in terms of hierarchies, like, it might be that you need things like motor control as like a precursor to like working memory. I'm trying to think how to put this properly. Now, that's a question for the end, really, because we could go off onto a big tangent in this one. Do you want to remember that one for the end, why it could be? I think... No, I couldn't give you a proper scientific answer. I would be speculating, basically. But I'm happy to speculate at the end. Okay, to give you an example of a person with orbitofrontal syndrome. Now, I don't want to say anything that might identify a person I've worked with because of client confidentiality. What I'll do, I'll sort of make up an example from some people. I did see 2 brain-injured people get into a fight over whose chair it was. So one of them went up for a walk around the room. When he came back, someone else was sitting in his chair and just went for him. Because it made him angry, and he had no self-control to hold himself back. Sometimes you'll get people that will wander up to you and tell you a story that they're really enthusiastic about, but actually you are really not interested in what they're saying at all, because it's really quite boring and pointless. Perhaps might have nothing to do with the context of what you were talking about, and they'll sort of go on and on. People with a milder level of this sort of damage might seem as though they're sort of 3 or 4 pints ahead of the rest of us. So I used to go swimming with a brain-injured group, and some of the people had physical disabilities and needed a lot of help. Others were physically fine, but disinhibited in terms of their self-control. So one chap, I had to just keep him away from some of the ladies in the pool who we'd sort of swim up to and say hello, like this, right? Which would be fine if we were in a bar at like 11 in the evening, but at 10 o'clock in the morning in a public swimming pool, it wasn't appropriate behaviour. So I almost felt bad for telling him off, because I said, yeah, in another social context, mate, it'll be fine, but not now, you know. Okay, so just to show you where it is, as I say, it's just below the orbit of the eyes. The eye would be roughly about here. So that's to show you where the area is. And it's often referred to as the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, because this is the bottom of the brain, so it's the belly kind of thing. And also the medial areas as opposed to the lateral areas, but they've labelled them both there. Okay, so theoretically, Antoine Baccara and Antonio Damasio's research group, which I believe is based in New York, but previously Iowa, certainly for Damasio, have suggested that they think that the orbitofrontal cortex is critical to the anticipation of future rewards and future punishments. So this is why if we have a drink, we stop worrying about the future. But if we've had too much to drink, we really might not worry about what the consequences of our behaviour is. And it's a nice theory and it makes sense to me. I think that they're probably on exactly the right track. There are also some neuropsychological tests which back them up with some good data. But I don't think I've really got time to talk about those. So we're up to about an hour now already, aren't we?
Question.
Yeah.
In the original diagram of the brain, that the orbital frontal cortex, which was shown as processing smells.
Oh yeah, this is an interesting one. The olfactory bulb, somewhere around about there. An interesting fact is that a lot of psychopaths lack a sense of smell. And for ages, people were just like, psychopaths, they can't smell anything, why is this? Probably turns out that some of them had orbitofrontal damage, and because his sense of smell is right next to the orbitofrontal cortex, it's getting damaged at the same time. And if you think about it, if you don't have any fear of future consequences, if you see a laptop in the back of a car, you might smash the window and take it, because then you've got a laptop, right? And if you're not worried about future consequences, then that sort of reasoning makes sense to you, okay? Like, if somebody makes you angry and you don't have any fear of future consequences, getting in trouble, getting beaten up, that sort of thing, you might just swing for them because it makes sense. If you see what I mean, if you've lost the ability to anticipate the future for both positive or negative reasons, then that sort of reasoning makes sense to people. And when I've talked to people, to give you an example of another person with orbitofrontal injuries, I've said to him, do you ever worry about things? And he says, no, I don't worry about anything. And it's like, well, what if this happened? He's like, oh, I don't worry about that. And then if you point out to him that, oh, this could happen, he's like, oh, yeah, you're right, I should think about that. But then the next day, he'll still be being disinhibited and trying to kiss female members of staff and things like that, And you try to point out to these people, yes, I'd like to kiss some of those women as well, but it's not appropriate and we have to hold ourselves back and this sort of thing. An example of anticipating a future positive consequence would be a dog. You can get a dog, say, sit, holding the treat, and it sees the treat. It knows if it jumps up, it won't get it. So you can see the dog actually sitting there trembling, wagging its tail, inhibiting its desire to just leap and go for it immediately, because it knows that if it inhibits itself, it will get the reward. Likewise, a dog, hopefully, shouldn't jump up on the kitchen table and just start eating the food, even if it wants to, because it knows it will get in trouble. So these things have evolved in other animals as well. This isn't just purely part of human cognition. Okay, so the last part, oh sorry, no, not the last part, there's two more. Anterior prefrontal cortex, meaning the very front of the brain, is around about here. It can often be damaged at the same time as the orbitofrontal cortex because of its proximity. I mean, you can actually get all of these problems all at the same time as well. So I'm using very pure case study type examples to describe it to you, but you can actually get a lot of these problems at the same time, which makes it really difficult to assess people. Damage to the frontal pole seems to cause problems in terms of lack of insight, not understanding your problems. So the last chap I talked about with orbitofrontal damage, he knew that what he was doing wasn't sensible and that he should be worrying about things. But some people can have this sort of damage as well and they don't even think they've got a problem, which can make it a lot harder to actually help people out. People can also have problems with multitasking. They really can't do more than one thing at a time, so there is some utility to multitasking. And it's also theory of mind skills, so inferring from the context of a situation, people's facial expressions, their body language, their pitch and tone of voice, what sort of mood they might be in, and so whether your behaviour is appropriate for that reason. So I'll give you an example. If I was doing something, say if I was in the pub with Adam and I'd had a few beers, before Adam says, now Tom, you're really starting to piss me off now, he would actually just sort of frown or pull a facial expression or look away or look embarrassed. And hopefully if I've got good theory of mind skills, I would notice that. I think, oh right, I'm annoying him now. Yeah, I'll calm down a bit. But if you've lost that sort of cognition and those sort of abilities, then you haven't got a reason to hold yourself back. So here's a picture of the anterior prefrontal cortex. We've got a slice of the brain. I think we're looking from the bottom up. So this red area is very proximate to the orbitofrontal cortex, and this is to do with reflecting on one's own or others' mental states, which is basically metacognition and theory of mind skills. And this is something that people with autistic conditions aren't good at as well. So from understanding brain injury, we can actually start to build models of other psychological conditions and understand a bit more about them as well. There's also areas for multitasking and episodic memory retrieval, and this is actually from imaging studies but also brain lesion studies as well. So when you get agreement between two different methods, that's also a sign that you're not barking up the wrong tree. Okay, so getting on to the last couple of these areas now. Yes, Adam? Yeah?
What's TOM?
TOM is an abbreviation for theory of mind. I think I probably just typed that in without considering the mind of my audience. So yeah, TOM is theory of mind skills. Okay, so now what we've got is the amygdala, which if you've ever read anything about the amygdala in the media, you should know it's critical to various different sorts of emotions. There's some evidence to suggest that the right amygdala is more involved in negative emotions and the left amygdala is more involved in positive emotions. That's the work of Richard Davidson that he's done in the University of Wisconsin. Unfortunately, I've not put a reference in for that. The amygdala gives us some emotional value, and then it's linked up to other prefrontal cortex areas, including the orbitofrontal cortex. So if the right amygdala is giving us an emotional message like fear, if you get damage to that, not only will you have no fear in the moment, but you'll have no anticipatory fear either. So you might have a problem that's